So there is English and German. If you need translation, I will speak German. So if you need a translation into English, please adjust your headphones. Sehr geehrter André Zagorski,
Dear André Zagorski, Gernot Erler, Carsten Vogt, representatives of the diplomatic corps here in Germany, experts who participated in the project, dear friends and guests of the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation.
Heute ist unser Thema
Today, the issue on our agenda is giving shape to the relations between Russia and the Eastern Central European countries. That is what's on our agenda tonight. I would like to elaborate on this in great detail in order to inform you about how we came up with this issue, and I would like to provide the details to Gernot Erler. He will speak to you in depth. How did we come up with this subject matter? We, in the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation, have created a tight liaison network of offices in Russia and almost all the Central and Eastern European countries. The first liaison office, by the way, was inaugurated back then in 1989 in the Soviet Union in Moscow. The liaison offices in Warsaw, Prague, Bratislava, Budapest, and so on and so forth were only opened up after 1990 and took up the work after lots of transformation processes and velvet and other revolutions which took place in the region. In all these liaison offices, we work actively together in the field of foreign and security policies. We analyze the relations of those respective countries to the European Union and the foreign relations of these countries to countries which are not members of the European Union. We continuously work in analyzing the relations between Russia and the European Union, and it is quite clear that the issue of Russia and the European Union and its relations to each other can only be dealt with in a multilateral context. Here, a German-Russian dialogue would not be far-reaching enough. It is also clear that the countries of Central and Eastern Europe are natural players in this context. And this understanding has led to the situation that we decided to give a stimulus to this new development back in 2011. Gernot Erler was one of the co-founders. Gernot Zagorski was one of our main partners on the Russian side. Carsten Vogt participated in this process on a regular basis and provided us with continuity.
Ein vorläufiges Zwischenergebnis über diesen Prozess zu ziehen. Und zwar nur über einen Teil. Ein Teil der Untersuchung war historisch, also was ist ab 1991 zwischen Russland und seinen Nachbarn geschehen. Daraus wird ein dickes Buch, das ist nicht im Zentrum des heutigen Abends. Das Buch kommt erst noch raus. Aber der zweite Punkt, eine kleine Veröffentlichung, die wir hier vorlegen, die debattiert werden soll mit Experten, die an dem Thema beteiligt haben, die sollen darüber nachsinnen, was auf einer politischen Ebene an diesem Thema weiter nach vorne getragen werden kann. Und zwar als Empfehlung aus der Sicht von außenpolitischen Experten, außenpolitischen Instituten und Institutionen und verschiedenen Akteuren der Zivilgesellschaft. Also schon die Frage, was solche politikbegleitenden, politikberatenden Institutionen und die Zivilgesellschaft bewirken können, um die politische Entscheidungsfindung der dafür Befähigten und Befugten in geeigneter Weise anzustoßen. Also das Material zu liefern, von dem wir hoffen, dass es dann später politisch aufgegriffen
that is needed in order to come up much more easily with political decisions. Tonight we try to take stock, we try to focus on the recommendations in the course of the debate of all or some of the experts who were involved in the process. I would like to thank all the experts that I mentioned before and all the others who participated for their active position in this process. And now I'd like to ask Gernot Erler to take the floor and provide us with more detailed information about the very substance of the quality report.
Дорогой Андрей Владимирович, Alexander
Kalweit, Carsten Vogt, colleagues, Reinhard Krumm, thank you very much for the invitation. That gives me the opportunity to say a few introductory remarks on the topic of Russia and Eastern Central Europe, on the topic of revitalization of the neighborhood. It is a quite ambitious and courageous title, and as Alexander Kalweit already mentioned, so this is a new start in the Russian and ECE relations. I'm not going to anticipate what Andrei is going to tell you about, because I always think it's disastrous when the initial speaker just already anticipates what the main speaker is going to say. But let me just talk a little bit about what we started 2 years ago. And I would like to answer the question whether in the meantime, that is in the past 2 years, the initial starting point has changed. So regional responsible partnerships in a responsible future relationship is the title of the speech that I held on the 17th of May in 2011 on the occasion of this conference in Moscow. And I had the following hypothesis at the time. So first of all, I said that the European Union has a lot of experience that they were able to experience with regional cooperation, that could be also called organized neighborhood. And I explained that there are 7 regions in which the EU has been active since the 90s. So the first activity was the Baltic Sea cooperation starting in 1992, and this was then expanded to the northern dimension in 2011, and then the EU Baltic strategy, and then there's the European neighborhood policy since 2003, and in 2009 it was expanded to a partnership. In 1999 there was a stability pact in Eastern Europe, and it then was transferred into the European Regional Council in Sarajevo, and since 2007 there have been 2 additional cooperation activities, that is the Black Sea region and the Central Asia strategy of the EU. And there's the Barcelona strategy in 1995, and that was then called the EU strategy for the Mediterranean Sea. And there is then the Danube strategy that we started a couple of years ago within the EU. That shows that the EU has made a continuous effort to get active in the region. And at the beginning, there is always the own experience that people have, which is positives. That is to have a win-win situation. So when you see that there is the experience of a prosperous development and the experience of peace and solidarity, and so to create that in the framework of cooperation within the region. So that is a positive experience that can always be the basis of it. And at the time, I've already gave some kind of balance sheet here and took stock that these attempts have not always been successful with these regional cooperation strategies, and that it would make sense to look into the matter more in depth, because from time to time and several points there was stagnation rather than progress. And looking back now, I can say that we've had another experience. So after all the things that we have seen in Northern Africa, that is the Arab Spring, leading to the problems that we no longer call spring as we see it today. So we know that the region of the Mediterranean Sea is not really a successful region in our partnership. That is, it hasn't achieved the goals that we have set ourselves. So that is my thesis at the time, was then concluded by an appeal to the EU to start on a learning path again and to learn more about how to bring about success in regional cooperations and the close cooperation with Russia, which in the end is inevitable, should be used right from the start, because Russia is important in all the regional projects in around the Black Sea, but also the Mediterranean and also Central Asia. And my second thesis was that a strategic partnership on behalf of Germany, Russia, and the EU and Russia should not only be based on intensifying economic relations, but this is also confronted with questions that haven't been resolved yet, and also confronted with some impediments. And these impediments come from the post-Soviet region, and that is the region of the Warsaw Pact organizations and the countries that were involved in this organization. That is, the countries that play an important role today, so from the region of Eastern and Central Europe, so that is the three Baltic states of Estonia, Lithuania, and Letland, and then Czech Republic and Hungary, and in some cases Romania, and in theory also Bulgaria can be added to that. And what we see there is that the political experience of negative experience is still there, and that still plays an important role today, and this is mirrored in the limited trust that people still have towards Russia, towards Moscow, and there's still fear of Russia dominating the region. And at the time, at this conference in Moscow in 2011, I described the integration mechanisms of EU and NATO and what their role was for these countries. Many of these new accession countries, having joined these two collective organizations, just joined them or are still interested in it because of the motivation they wanted to be protected against Russia, not because they wanted to cooperate with Russia, but they want to be protected against Russia. And in their work in the European Union, but also within NATO, they try to go along these lines. But automatically speaking, this is an impediment for shaping new strategic partnerships between Germany and Russia, but particularly between the European Union and the Russian Federation. And a logical solution would be to make an attempt to improve the neighborhood relations between the Russian Federation and the ECE nations in order to normalize them, to bring about normalcy again. And so my recommendation was at the time that we should start a parallel learning process because, as I said before, the European Union should reconsider their strategic activities, but also we should initiate a process to do the same with the relationships of the Russian Federation towards its neighboring countries. So the idea was to get together jointly and talk about it and think about it so that there's nobody lecturing somebody to tell the others what to do, but that we should try and find a solution altogether. And I believe one of the elements would be the following, and I see that also in the interim report that has been presented today. So to talk about historic traumas and about ways of overcoming them, because these traumas play a prominent role in a lot of bilateral relations, and of course we should also include not only an economic cooperation that we have seen on the rise in the past few years, but see to it that this won't lead to any type of dominance or any type of hegemony, but any type of taking power, but rather to something else. And that takes me to my third thesis that we discussed at the time, that is to bring about a regional partnership of responsibility, of taking responsibility jointly. In 2011, we had already seen good steps between Russia and Poland. After a long history of problems, they had made quite a lot of progress of improving their situation. The tragedy of Chernobylsk changed the relationships, and also the opening of the archives with regard to Khartoum. And the cooperation among historians, for example, and a regional partnership of responsible partners should also think about regions of influence. So, for example, when you look at the neighboring countries, that would mean that a regional hegemony position should not be what people should strive for, and not a monopoly either, for example, in the field of energy resources. That should not be the point, but rather a reorganization of the post-Soviet area on the basis of authentic partnerships, on the basis of equal partners in a level playing field, and also respecting sovereign rights of the partnership organizations and to do away with them. So we have to always understand that the European Union, without renouncing sovereign rights, would have never worked. And it is a very important point that you give up some of your sovereignties. And this is another point that we have seen intensify over the past 2 years. When you look at the role of the scheme of the Eurasian Union, in the election campaign of President Putin, we have seen that, and also the texts that we received in 2011 already about the Eurasian area and the Eurasian Economic Organization. They used the wording very similar to the European Union style, so that they gave the impression that something similar was attempted for the post-Soviet area. And when you look at that, then you see that the idea of a joint learning process about organizations of regional partnerships would make sense. You could say that the development or the evolution in this regard shows that this topic is as current as it was in 2011. So now the question is, what is different now? What is different from what the situation was like in 2011? And then the aspect of this being a very topical issue, is that something different now? So when you look at the relationship of Russia towards the countries of the Central and Eastern European region, then I believe that it should be a regional partnership. When you look at the difference between what was the situation like in 2011 and now what the situation is like in 2013, so of course we have to mention the crisis within the European Union, and the countries in the region were suffering from the crisis, and they turned to the EU for help, and the promise of prosperity that the EU always has implicitly was then challenged, or rather put into doubt. So today, you can't just ignore what is happening in Hungary. So with their constitutional reforms that they adopted with a 2/3 majority just yesterday, and it is a very difficult issue, and it's going to be even more difficult in the future within the European Union. But you also have to remind the migration movements from Romania and Bulgaria, particularly by Roma people, towards more wealthy regions, and they also are a litmus test for the solidarity of the European Union, and that is a type of solidarity that goes both ways. This is also a process that was very important in the past 2 years, and by that I mean the stagnation of the EU enlargement process. So now Croatia is hopefully about to join, so hopefully it'll be on the agenda for the beginning of June, and for the beginning of July. So, but you should also bear in mind that this is a process that has been going on for 80 years, and nobody knows how this is going to be developed in the future. So what about the enlargement process after that, so especially with regard to the Western Balkans? So when I look back at these three theses I had already presented in 2011, I see that these are challenges that are decisive even for the future of the European Union. But when you look at the partners, nothing is smooth on either side, not even with the Russian side. In 2008, we saw an increased tension between the Western countries and the Russian Federation, and there was an event on the 10th of February in 2007 when Vladimir Putin gave his enraged speech at the Security Council in Munich, and he kind of announced his aggressive mood, and in the question of Kosovo, this became clear in the future. But most drastically, it happened on the 8th of 8th, 8/8, so that is what we always call it on the 8th of August in 2008, with the conflict that happened there. So the EU was able to help bring about truce, however, but this was a type of the high time of tension and aggression from the Russian side. And this phase, however, was finished by the reset policy of Barack Obama. His policy helped Russia to get out of the isolation, so then all of a sudden they were equal partners again. And then there's the issue where the U.S. tried to reduce the threats of ballistic aggression, and also the New START agreement, and then the task of enlarging the EU by Ukraine and Croatia. So this was a good starting point, but we should mention these as some of the elements of what happened in the past 2 years. And then the Arab Spring, the Arabellions started, and this led to high frustration by the Russians with regard to Libya, for example, but also with what is happening in Syria at the moment. We can say that we may see another isolation of Russia within a global policy framework, and whether we like it or not, and this seems to be a fact. And then the elections are of February in 2012, and also the presidential election this year. So they were accompanied, and we all know that they were accompanied by civil unrests in Russia, and there was a hope that a dialogue would be initiated afterwards, and between the organizers of these unrests and the elected president, so as Mr. Putin was re-elected on the 4th of March. But this didn't happen, unfortunately. I don't want to go into detail about that, but this dialogue never happened. But it also led to the domestic developments within Russia being a point of discussion here in the West. That means, so we can see a somewhat isolation policy by Russia's foreign policy, but also by its domestic policy. I, however, am very aware that in the Syria question, there has been some attempt for rapprochement in the past few weeks. But in my assessments, this won't lead to a reset policy by the U.S. President, because there's a different phase now of the political situation in the U.S., and the position of the Congress is also different, and we also have a new conflict with regard to missile defense, because this question has not lost its aggravation. So there are now other countries, so it's no longer the Czech Republic and Poland, but it is Romania and Turkey now. And we have serious problems in this regard. Ladies and gentlemen, this is a new context, this is a new setting against which we need to discuss the relations between Russia and Central and Eastern Europe. And I want to reiterate that in all these ECE countries that are members of NATO and the EU, so there is their potential of providing impediments for the improvement of the relationship between the European Union and Russia. And that can be a problem for regional partnerships and also for the other partnerships. So the redevelopment or reorganization of the post-Soviet area and the relations between Russia and its Western neighbors play an important role. So you will never find this in the headlines of the current papers, because there are other dramatic events happening that have replaced them. But I would dare to state that because of the critical situation, as I had to describe, the situation has actually become worse. So bringing about some type of normalcy in the relationship between Russia and the ECE countries is still highly pivotal, and also the relations between the EU and Russia and Germany and Russia should still have room for improvement. So this is so much my summary. So now we are looking forward to the presentation by Andrzej Zagorski, who is going to present the policy paper, because this is a joint exercise by several experts from various countries. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Kalweit, dear Gernot, dear Carsten, dear Reinhard. I will have to be brief, and please forgive me for being a bit hoarse, but I lost my voice in Moscow. But I'll try my very best to highlight on some of the most important issues and present some of our interim results to you. But first of all, I would like to express my gratitude. I think I can speak on behalf of all those who participated in this project. Thanks for the excellent support that was rendered to us by the Friedrich-Ebert-Foundation, not only during the project, but also afterwards, and also in all the follow-up meetings that we've had. We started off to cast a glance into the past. We tried to analyze the situation as it presented itself to us of the last 20 years between the countries of Central and Eastern Europe and Russia in order to pave the way for the future. The book that we published, which is going to be printed in the next few months to come, summarizes these developments in detail. Of course, in some parts we cannot go too much into the detail, but sometimes we describe specific cases. We focus on some Central European countries and their relations on Russia, but these are rather the exceptions than the rule. Some of the interim reports were summarized in the policy paper, and I'll try my very best to share some of the most important points of this policy paper from my viewpoint with you tonight. To my mind, it is a very important statement to say that 15 years after the end of the Cold War, a lot has been achieved, a lot of structural changes have taken place, also with regards to the relations between Russia and Eastern and Central Europe. Let me just mention the most important ones. The Russian troops have been withdrawn, new treaties have been signed, the states of Central and Eastern Europe have become full members of NATO and the EU. This did not come about without a controversy. We've had a lot of controversies in the late 90s and also in the late 80s and the early 90s. You know, we were sometimes warned. Russia said that, well, if you don't do this or that, we will delay or postpone the withdrawal of the troops. But this is very important to us. This was a rather interesting phase in our history. And this chapter of our history has been brought to an end. And we have laid a completely new foundation for a potential new beginning in our relationship to Russia. And I think despite all the controversies, we have learned and state very clearly and unambiguously in our policy paper that apart from the fact that the Central and Eastern European states are firmly anchored in the Atlantic and European institutions, apart from all the controversies, Russia accepted to live with it. That, to my mind, is a very important statement because it provides food for thought on where to go from here. Now, when we cast a glance into the future, we've had major problems in the course of our discussions, not only because East Cage differs profoundly from the other, but also because I think we all drew the conclusion that we do not really know what a new beginning is supposed to look like. What we've learned was that since the late 90s, or at least at the beginning, since the years of 2000 and so on, we have tried to analyze what our vested interests are. We try to define common positions and find common positions, and what we focused on more than anything else is economic cooperation. Of course, this is clearly understandable because the Central and Eastern European states had already become full members of the European Union. For most of these countries, the greatest share of the GDP or the exports to the EU is extremely high and lies above average. And now the question is, where are the markets where we can look out for further growth? Because we have reached the potential that could be tapped. And Russia seems to be another market offering additional new potential, especially on the basis of the partnership of modernization. So a lot of countries would like to get a foot in the door. But we have learned from experience that trade has increased erratically. It flourishes. Of course, there were downtimes and times of crises, but economic cooperation has gained a lot of momentum. Of course, there were differences here or there. There are some difficulties here or there. Structurally speaking, not everything runs completely smoothly, but we were quite successful in this regard. But at the same time, we've also learned that there was a basic transformation in the bilateral or regional relations. So the effects that improved economic cooperation and close trade relations has had were quite significant. Of course, there were success stories, there was progress. It differs from country to country, of course, and I hope that my colleagues can subscribe to my point of view, but you will also realize tonight how different our viewpoints are. We are a rather heterogeneous group, which makes our discussions so interesting. But the question is, where do we go from here now that we've completed the first chapter? How do we begin with a new chapter remains completely unanswered. Improving economic relations, strengthening economic ties has not helped us develop a very strong vision for the future, and we still have very diverging views and opinions. This is why we really tried to cast a glance into the future. We tried to answer some questions and pass on recommendations to politicians on where additional potential can be tapped. How can our mutual or regional relations be improved? Let me just refer to one point. We have identified those areas where relevant issues need to be further addressed. Some old questions have been done away with, but there are new questions in the field of security that need to be addressed. Bilateral relations, regional security issues with regards to the US, mutual confidence and trust needs to be strengthened. That concerns especially the erosion of the system of control of the arms race in Europe. The closer the good neighborly relations are, the more important these questions become. Questions, we talk about the questions concerning security of supply of energy. I don't know of any country in Central Eastern Europe where this issue is of no significance in relation to Russia, or they all have different positions and are of diverging views. So this issue needs to be addressed, no matter whether you do it on a bilateral or regional level. And thirdly, other questions need to be factored in, which are hardly ever being discussed in bilateral relations. This is good neighborly relations. But we also jointly drew the following conclusion. We did not speak intensively with each other enough. Today, we don't talk enough to each other still. So we need to open up a candid and open dialogue and put all the difficult issues on the agenda. Some people are, or some countries are rather afraid of Russia. If you want to make concessions, and if you're willing to give in, you don't get a reply back. Our entire development shows that if you give a gesture and show goodwill for cooperation, you get a similar reply. But if you show that you're not willing to act based on goodwill, you also get a compatible reaction. So we should enter into a more intensive, open dialogue, which is nothing that can be taken for granted. Therefore, we recommend to introduce an institutionalized and structuralized dialogue. This is what we've learned from the Russian-Polish relation. It shows very clearly that this is particularly important in times of dire straits, when there is hardly any common mutual position. But the institutionalized, structuralized, open dialogues helps achieve greater progress and bring about positive effects for the realm of politics on both sides, where very significant questions can be addressed. But we are a far cry from it. Lots of positions are profoundly diverging from each other. Therefore, tomorrow we meet again in the morning in order to decide on the next steps that we would like to take as a group of experts. What are the issues that we would like to put on our agenda? What are the subject matters that need to be addressed? We all have diverging views and opinions about it, and where do we want to head from here? How do we want to pave the way into the future? Furthermore, we try to go beyond the limits of our circle of experts. We want to include other regions and other countries in this dialogue as much as we can. Well, I try to summarize the results of this interim report from my own viewpoint, but in the course of the discussion you will realize that each and every scholar is of a different opinion. Now, therefore, I'm particularly delighted that we have such a great group of co-authors of this policy report here in this room. We managed to agree on a common denominator. Of course, this does not reflect all the views that are represented here by the scholars in this room. Thanks very much once again, and I'm really looking forward to a lively discussion.
So welcome again from the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation. As you can hear, I'm talking in English. If that is a problem for you, there are earphones outside. Channel 1 is German, channel 2 is English. Why I'm doing this? Because it would be easier for discussion if I speak English. Russia and East Central Europe, a fresh start. As you can see on the map, there is no exclamation mark and there is no question mark. So it could be a question, it could be, yes, there will be a fresh start. I cannot promise you that we come to a final result today, but the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation, with all the experts, and I would like to thank them again for coming and participating in this project, it is a very vital issue how East Central European countries of the EU and Russia find a decent relationship. A lot has been done. Gernot was talking about it, Alexander and André. And
Our mission, so to speak, is to give you an idea about the diversity on this issue with the 4 panelists we have. And after about half an hour, I would like to invite you to ask those questions you would like to ask. Immediately, I would like to introduce the 4 panelists. On your left, Carsten Vogt, former member of parliament and under the Chancellor Schröder in charge of German-US relations. Next to him, Sławomir Debski, he's the director, Center for Polish-Russian Dialogue and Understanding from Warsaw. Mr. Vilpišauskas is the director, Institute of International Relations and Political Science, University of Vilnius, Lithuania. And Andrzej Zagorski, who has already spoken to you, he is from GIMO and from IMEMO. He's one of the co-organizers and basically the co-initiator with Gernot Erler of this project. I also would like, not personally introduce everybody, but the first and second row, we have experts besides Poland and Russia and Lithuania, from the Czech Republic, from Slovakia, from Hungary. Participants from Latvia and Estonia and Romania couldn't come, not because they disagree, but there were other difficulties so they couldn't come. After our discussions, we have the discussion with you. At the same time, we have a live stream, so the world is looking at you and us. Mr. Felix Hett is in charge of that, and if we find some good comments, some good questions, Felix will give this to us. As we have heard from André, the policy paper means looking forward, and I think the idea of this discussion should be looking forward. To have an idea on subjects in the next couple of years we could discuss, very diverse. We'll see this, you will hear this during the discussion. One of the sentences from the recommendations or from the policy paper in general was relations between the East Central Europe states and Russia have not yet been properly repaired. Therefore, some of the recommendations which Andrzej Zagorski already read out to you are regular political dialogue, discuss difficult issues, and institutionalize the dialogue. This is the form, these are the instruments. The question is, what about the subjects, the content? Last week, there was the 100th anniversary of the society, the German Society for Eastern Europe. As you can see, Eastern Europe is quite of an importance for Germany. 100 years, and one of the speakers, the keynote speakers, said that the EU is a workshop for the future. And that would be the question for all the panelists. What do you think could be done from the East Central European countries in the EU and from Russia to find those themes and projects we clearly need to move forward with the relationship between Russia and those countries? André put out a couple: energy, security, Eastern Partnership. Gernot said history. I would like to know from you about the subjects and about a way to tackle that, to move forward, to come possibly to a vision or to formulate a couple of themes and subjects we should discuss for the next couple of years. And Mr. Debski, I would like to start with you on that. I think you have a microphone.
Yes, thank you very much for having me here in this panel. I represent a unique institution in the landscape of not only Russia, Central European relations, but also more general Russia external relations as such. Let me explain just basic things about who I am and institution which I represent. In 2008, both governments, Polish and Russian, decided that they need to establish a group of experts to tackle the problems mostly having their roots in the past. Both governments required recommendations from the group how they should deal with the most painful, difficult problems, which are not of political character, but mainly of historical character. As I said, they have their roots in the past, but they overshadow somehow the process of communication between two governments. So the group for difficult matters, so-called, was established. After a year of work, the group produced a recommendation that in order to tackle effectively the problem of stereotypes, misunderstandings, lack of knowledge between Polish and Russian society, we need institutions. We need institutions which would permanently deal with such problems, which would enhance the communication between the societies, which would support exchange of views, for instance, which would establish actually the system of exchange of views between Poland and Russia. So in Poland, the Center for Polish-Russian Dialogue and Understanding was established by the Act of Parliament. In Russia, similar institution was also established by the Act of President. It is a foundation, a Center for Russian-Polish Dialogue and Understanding. So there are two engines which are thought to work permanently to bring in the purpose of bringing closer to societies. So, speaking of from my perspective as a head of such institution, I can say the following. To enhance the communication between countries of Central and Eastern Europe with Russia, we need to institutionalize this dialogue. We need new institutions which should work permanently with the most difficult and painful problems that are between the countries in question. And by the way, it is one of the most important recommendations in our policy paper. Of course, it's not easy to establish such an institutions. The goodwill is the basic precondition. And the timing is also the crucial in this affair. For instance, I have doubt whether we would be able to establish such an institution, I mean, between Poland and Russia today, for very different reasons. Between 2010, 2011 appeared the kind of the window of opportunity we used. So the timing is also important, because such an institution could work on enhancing the communication between the countries and the societies, political elites, youth, even in the times of the bad weather. That's the most important and crucial thing. We need to establish the foundations for these communications, because without that, without the staff, without the financing, it's quite easy to downgrade these relations when it's necessary for political reasons. Having this institution is much more difficult to do that. So that's one of the recommendations which are basing on Polish-Russian experience, the best practices. But it is, of course, difficult to say when the window of opportunity for the others may appear. Thank you.
So you don't want to give us an idea not only about the form, which is an institute, which is a permanent dialogue, but a subject?
There is, of course, general subject. I mean, general problem in relations between countries of Central Europe and Russia. I mean, it is lack of confidence. It is a difficult deficit of knowledge, and lack of the instruments of effective communication, for different reasons. My perception is that, generally speaking, countries of Central Europe are much more interested in Russia than vice versa. Russian foreign policy doctrine, generally speaking, emphasizes or gives the priority to the relations with other countries perceived in Moscow as a great powers. Because through these relations, Russia or Russian foreign policy makers reaffirms themselves in their status of great power. Unfortunately, through the relations with the countries of Central Europe, this part of the Russian political elite couldn't find this kind of reaffirmation. So the only way how we can try to do something with that is go further with institutionalization of the communication between these countries, because it would help to influence or to have an impact on the process of shaping Russian foreign policy, in a long way, of course.
Really, thank you very much. Now I would come to my partner to your right, Mr. Schauskas. The same questions. Yes, we do have the form. What about the content?
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Also, my thanks to Friedrich-Ebert Foundation for organizing this event and the whole project, and also to Andrei for organizing a big part of it. If we talk about substance, of course there are issues like different interpretation of history, something which is discussed in the paper which is being presented today. But I'm not a historian, so I will not go into this. I can just say that there are quite different perceptions, and these perceptions, at least if we talk about the Baltic states and how they see the past Soviet period after the Second World War and occupation that followed it, and how Russian leadership sees it, it remains quite different. There is a gap, and I'm not sure it's narrowing down. There are also issues linked to security. Kaliningrad region, armed forces in this region, military exercises, things which are colored by mutual suspicion, I would say. Again, I'm not expert in these issues, so I cannot comment more. I'm coming from political economy perspective, so I would just give several ideas on what I see probably as the #1 issue on Lithuania's and probably also Latvia's, Estonia's agenda if we think about relations with Russia. And this is economic interdependence, which I would distinguish into two different parts. One is trade in different goods where there is no asymmetrical dependence by one side, and then trade in goods where there is complete asymmetrical dependence, and this is first of all natural gas and to some extent electricity. To some extent oil, but oil is not an issue anymore. So of course if we talk about trade in other goods, which is governed by WTO, if we talk about instruments, I think WTO is quite good forum for discussing these issues. These relations, they are quite smooth. There used to be, and there are still sometimes frictions, disputes about the quality standards. Sometimes, you know, when there are different stories about food products which are discovered unsafe. We have similar issues in the EU, recent horse meat scandal, if we can call it so. So there are these issues, but I think they are being managed in a more or less acceptable to both sides way. And here Russia's membership in WTO really should help. At least that's my hope, and I think many people hope so. However, if we talk about energy area where there is complete asymmetry in the relationship and there is no choice in some cases for buyers of natural gas in the Baltic states, here I think there is extreme mistrust, probably on both sides, and in Lithuania, for example, the key objective or the key medium-term goal is to create alternative sources of supply. That's clearly the most important objective, which of course might sound paradoxical if we talk about bilateral relations with Russia, but you have to have in mind that this does not mean cutting off links with Russia, closing down pipelines or electricity grids, but creating possibilities for alternative sources of supply. In other words, competition. Something which is lacking in the EU in general. I mean, we lack common market in the energy sector, as you know. There is a goal of the EU to have it functioning by 2014. I doubt that this will happen because of too big diversity of regulatory regimes in the European Union, but I think for the Baltic states, the key goal is to have Baltic, Nordic, Polish market in natural gas and electricity functioning by 2015. And if this happens, I think, and many people in the Baltics think, this would provide a very welcome boost to Baltic-Russian relationship because it would give more confidence in a sense that energy issues become business as usual issues rather than something which is still seen and probably is being exploited for political purposes. So I think that's what we should have in mind, at least if we talk about the Baltic states. Another issue is, of course, Russia's membership or ratification of Energy Charter, something which is not on the agenda anymore. But again, if we talk about instruments, I think we should not forget things like that. Instead of creating new instruments, there are already existing ones. But you know, it's like with some other agreements where Russia is quite reluctant to join and to follow the same principles and rules like the rule of law and others. So I think if this happens, that would of course contribute immensely to mutual trust and better relations.
Excellent, thank you very much. Mr. Zagorski, I've heard lack of trust, mistrust before we came to you. We had a small discussion before, and one of the participants said that yes, we have some recommendation of experts, but realpolitik, real policy looks quite different. So, Andrei, from your perspective, what could be a signal from Russia? Which topics could be tackled realistically?
I believe the main problem we have is that neither Russia nor most of the East Central European countries have a clear idea why they would need an improved relationship. So a question for many people in Moscow would be, okay, all sounds nice, but why should we engage other countries and why should we go ahead? This will be our internal debate. It will be important. I firmly believe the moment we proceed with the dialogue, the method could be very simple. We should just put all the issues we have on the table and this would form the agenda. With the basic principle, nothing should be dropped off the table. Every issue, if anyone has an issue, it needs to be addressed. If I judge from our discussions we had, I would say the most urgent issue, or most important, most tenuous issue for the time being is energy security. Although it is handled in a very different way by different countries, that's why my suggestion would be that we have it not on a bilateral basis, but have a regional meeting or so. The problem is similar anywhere. The solutions are different. And just looking both at where the problem is, how it is tackled with, where the solutions may be, and then where we go next step. My second item would be still new issues of security, because I believe we do have several developments which contribute to mistrust on both sides, and if we do address those issues appropriately, it could increase political trust in general in the relationship. Ramones has already mentioned exercises on the Russian side, there are exercises on the Baltic states, there are exercises in Poland, all with what is the chapeau of contingency planning. An exercise in NATO raises concerns in the Russian defense establishment at least. So we need to sit together and talk about this, because there are many cooperative solutions which could be feasible. We do discuss it, particularly with our Polish colleagues, developing suggestions of what could be done at the bilateral level, voluntarily, on both sides. And of course, giving greater transparency of where we are on new security issues is very important to improve trust on both sides.
Thank you. Carsten, I had a chance to talk to Egon Bahr yesterday, and he was very worried about security, about missile defense. Is that one of those topics one should definitely find common ground? I think the microphone works just like that.
Ich glaube das ehrlich gesagt nicht.
I, quite honestly speaking, don't think so. I do hold the view that social problems today are just as important as security-related questions. Security-related questions in Europe cannot be separated completely from social policy issues. If Russia was a stable and sound democracy, some political perceptions might be able to change in Central and Eastern Europe. During the Cold War, social problems could not be resolved, and for that matter, they had to be separated completely from security-related issues. But if you're trying to look into the future of Europe today, of course you might do so in negotiations, but if you want to develop a vision for Europe in the future, you can't do that anymore. But I think we can learn a lesson in the following regard. First of all, with regards to one point, which I can touch upon very briefly. You should not exclude history, but you should rather put it on the agenda. During the Cold War, nobody made mention of history, but if you want to improve relations on both sides, you have got to talk about history, not necessarily come up with a common position, but you've got to discuss it. After the Second World War, it would not have been possible for Germany to bring about changes without discussing historic events. As odd as this might sound, but it's a practical political necessity to talk about history. It's not a history which is made up by historians, but it changes the perception of entire countries. It doesn't take days or years, but it takes decades. But it is quite significant. And the second point might be even more important. But the problems that this government had with Russia, with Germany, and in the past also with France was the problem concerning the asymmetrical distribution of power.
Verringert sich, wenn ein Staat demokratisch wird.
And the problem can be mitigated if a state becomes democratic, but you can't solve it altogether. Even in the European Union, the structures that have been developed are in such a way that decisions cannot be brought about by Germany alone. And as a consequence of the EU enlargement, decisions cannot be made by Germany and France only. So the big states have lost some of their power concerning or in relation to the smaller states, because otherwise there will be no fairness and justice in Europe. If the big states made use of their military power, this would lead us right into the next European crisis. You know, this is what we have to repeat in Germany and again. Holding yourself back to a certain extent is very much in your own interest, and that is not the most dominant idea in Moscow today. When I speak to the Russians, they say that if you hold yourself back, you prove that you are weak. But holding yourself back is actually being smart. And the Germans hold themselves back not because we suffer from a neurosis as a consequence of the Second World War, but we know that the relationship between the big and the small states in Europe has led to problems for many centuries. And it will continue to be that way. And if we don't want crises from emerging again, the big ones have got to listen to the small ones. And they've got to make their voices heard.
Über diese Region, aber über Frankreich und Deutschland.
But you know, the Russians don't really have experts who know about the region, but they've got experts in Germany and France. Shows that they don't really take this region seriously enough. You know, these are structural problems that you need to become aware of. They've got something to do with the memory and the experience, which is deeply rooted in the region. Here, I don't think that we can teach the Russians a lesson. They have to learn from their own history, but we can tell them what we've learned from our own experience and communicate with them in order to pave the way for a common future.
I have one more question for all the panelists very shortly, and then I would like to include you. The second question I have is concerning the Eastern Partnership. Bigger countries or unions usually look for neighbors which think alike, kind of. Germany, after the East expansion of the EU, is surrounded basically by friends. I think one can say it that way. Russia is having problems with that after the fall of the Soviet Union, clearly. But if you look at the new foreign policy concept, quite a bit of paper, of articles, of words are aimed towards the CIS. And partly of the CIS is the Eastern Partnership from the European Union side. So we have a certain conflict of interests. The 6 countries in between, the 3 South Caucasian countries, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, then the Ukraine, Belarus, and the Moldova Republic, are both in the focus of the EU and of Russia. Is that a way to look at it? Is there maybe a topic how to combine forces, not to have another conflict, which we clearly don't need? Mr. Debski, I would like to ask you.
Well, in my view, there is a lot of misunderstanding and misperception in the debate about the Eastern Partnership, particularly between speakers representing the European Union and Russian side. Few very fundamental things have to be underlined. First, Eastern Partnership, it is an instrument of European Union policy towards the countries which are neighboring to European Union and which are willing to move closer towards European Union and our values and our rules and norms. So it is not a magnet. It is just instrument providing assistance for those who would like to use it. Actually, we have to also bear in mind that Eastern Partnership was built upon the fundaments laid by the older policy, so-called Eastern policy of the European Union, neighborhood policy, to which Russia in the past had been invited, but rejected this invitation of the European Union and decided to opt for the special status, and so-called 4 common spaces were established. that was a strategic mistake of Russian policy towards the European Union. I think it could be repaired in the way that I see no reason why the approximation between European Union and Russia should not appear. We still are waiting for a partnership cooperation agreement to be signed and the negotiation to be ended up. From my own perspective and my own experience, I wrote 7 years ago a kind of memo for Ministry of Foreign Affairs, responding to the question whether it's feasible to reach an agreement with Russia about new partnership cooperation agreement. And my analysis in 2006 was that my response was negative. And still 6-7 years passed and we are in the same place. I mean, in the same momentum. And I don't expect that we move forward this agenda. And unfortunately, it is because of Russia's approach to PCA, not because of lack or deficit of goodwill on the European Union side. We'd like to I mean, we, the Europeans, we'd like to see our relations with Russia to be deeper, to be institutionalized, and to be based on the new treaty regulating our relations. But we are still waiting for positive Russian response. And the same concerns, by the way, Eastern Partnership. It should not be perceived as a conflicting project, because as long as they are not accused of those who are willing to join the European Union, there is no problem, actually.
In the foreign policy concept of Russia, Ukraine is seen as a priority. That makes it difficult then to talk about Eastern Europe, Eastern Partnership as a way to move forward for better understanding, Andrei, is that correct?
Well, I think that first we should not have an illusion that in the short term we can develop sort of common vision for Eastern Partnership or what is the policy of Russia in this common neighborhood. Second, I believe we still need to talk with each other in order to avoid surprises or unnecessary problems which may occur from misperceptions of different policies. I thirdly believe that there is still a huge potential for at least achieve as much as possible harmony between the EU Eastern Partnership policy as well as of EU's relations with Russia, because whenever we talk about harmonization or approximation of normal grounds, we do have between Russia and the European Union a couple of dozens of structural dialogues. So what I would do, I would first of all check what we talk about with the European Union, what the European Union talks about with the Eastern partners, and wherever we find overlapping, I would do it gently, so that we move in the same direction, so that we don't increase divergences in the normative field, but increase convergences in normative fields. I'm well aware it will not be possible in every single area. Of course, energy would be a highly contested area of normative development, but there would be many, many issues in which we could develop common projects. And whenever we see that something is developing which could be of interest for our relationship with the EU, but is not happening, we can take it over. So I would look for creating convergences between Eastern Partnership and Russia wherever possible, well aware that there will be also diverging developments. And this could be platform for cooperation. Last point, whenever we talk about this, we should not do it by excluding the Eastern partners. They should be included in this development. And this is often very important because I learned at some point that even in Brussels, in the Commission, people who do the dialogues with Russia and people who do the Eastern Partnership are sitting at different desks and very seldom talk to each other. So they often don't know what the others are doing. And if we bring everyone together, this could help in seeing where we can produce more synergies.
Very good point. You from Lithuania, I think you host the summit of the Eastern Partnership in the autumn.
Yes, it's supposed to be in November on the Lithuanian EU presidency. It's good that you mentioned Ukraine, because I think Ukraine is now the test case of, to a large extent, the future of Eastern Partnership program. And to explain why, I would like to step back very shortly. Eastern Partnership is very much about economic issues. As Andrei said about convergence, but convergence of very technical, boring things like product standards, quality standards, environmental standards, phytosanitary standards, all these things which regulate trade, which open up markets for provision of services, investing and so on. And that's what forms basis of the so-called deep and comprehensive free trade agreements which are offered to Eastern partners. Now we see that there is Eurasian Customs Union in place already for a couple of years. From the ideal point of view of economists, the best arrangement would be completely free trade between EU, Eastern partners, and Eurasian Customs Union. That's what any economist, well, economists would first of all tell you global free trade is the best arrangement. Then the second best is regional. And the bigger the region is, the better it is, because more economies of scales you can reap and so on. But if we look into the existing regulatory standards, we can see that EU standards and Eurasian Customs Union standards are very different. That's one very important difference. And in order for Eurasian Customs Union to adopt EU standards, because that's how EU works, it exports its own standards. It basically does not accept, at least there are no such precedents. We will see with the US how the transatlantic free trade negotiations will go on. I would hope they would be successful, but I think there will be a lot of quarrel about regulatory standards. So if we talk about Eurasian Customs Union, the main probably option is for it to adopt EU standards, not the other way around. And they are costly. It costs companies to invest into stricter, more safer standards. So this will take a lot of time. The convergence that Andrei was talking about will be a long process. Plus, there are two more circumstances which make such an arrangement quite a long-term prospect. Kazakhstan and Belarus are not members of WTO, plus Belarus is quite a specific case, as we know, in terms of the rule of law and things like that, which are, well, important, so to speak, for signing free trade agreements by the European Union, at least until now. So why I'm saying all this is that Eurasian Customs Union will not sign any trade agreement with the EU in the foreseeable future, which means for countries like Ukraine, they have a dilemma, whether to move on integrating into the EU, finally signing, ratifying association and deep free trade agreement, if they fulfill certain political conditions, which are still to be fulfilled. Or they join Eurasian Customs Union, but then they will not be able to sign free trade agreements, because that would mean the whole Eurasian Customs Union becoming in free trade with the EU, which, for the reasons I mentioned, is not politically feasible. So that's why I think this year we might see a breakthrough or maybe continuation of situation as it has been for 1.5 years, almost 2 years in Ukraine, where we can see that there is kind of indecision by the leadership of a country. My guess is that this reflects the internal struggle between different interest groups. some interest groups which want to continue trading with Russia, with Eurasian Customs Union, other interest groups which see it more profitable to trade with European Union. So there is this internal competition, and the decision is very difficult, of course. There are hopes that by November summit in Vilnius, Ukraine will make up its mind. I'm not sure. Would be good if that happened and if they opted for the EU values, but I'm not sure.
Carsten, what's your take on the Eastern Partnership?
Also ich bin für eine möglichst enge Kooperation.
I believe that a very close cooperation, as close as possible, with Russia would be preferable, and also a partnership that is as close as possible with Ukraine. And I don't think that the cooperation with the Customs Union should not compete with the association agreement. I am in favor of signing the association agreement. And I am in favor of all the requirements that the European Union has established, and I hope that they will fulfill them. But in my heart, I'm all in favor of the association agreement, and then in the years that it will be necessary to ratify this agreement, then some other issues with Ukraine can be resolved. Why am I so wholeheartedly in favor of this? In Ukraine, we have a government and an opposition that are both in favor of association.
Es ist eine Weichenstellung.
It would be just setting a new course for the direction in which Ukraine wants to develop. It would be also a deepening of the political relations with the EU, and this is one of the reasons why the government as well as the opposition are in favor of it. I'm afraid that negative tendencies would also be aggravated if they did not sign the association agreement, and that would lead to adverse effects in the society, in my view. In my policy, I don't want to threaten people with some measures if people don't sign it. So because I don't want to use threats, but rather say that I am wholeheartedly in favor of the association agreement, and I want to see that happen. And this has nothing to do with the development and evolution of the European Union. Ukraine might not join the EU in the near future, and I'm not really sure that the EU is willing to incorporate Ukraine. But I believe turning towards the European Union would be of benefit for the development in its economic affairs, but also the rule of law, and it would make things easier for Ukraine. Thank you very much. I can now switch to German because we're going to start a discussion with you here in the audience. So those of you who have a question or a comment, please go ahead. And I would also like to ask the representatives from the countries of Eastern and Central Europe to step up if they have a question or a comment. Please go ahead.
Have discussed here, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. My name is Alexander Duleba. I'm from Slovakia. He's the director of the Research Center of the Slovak Foreign Policy Association. One sentence concerning the project. Really, I would like to congratulate the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation for supporting it. I mean, 20 years after the collapse of the Eastern Bloc, it was missing, this dialogue. And I think that one of the main conclusions which Andrzej Zagorski, the head of the project, simply introduced to you, that we turn a page. 20 years over, and now it's a time to recap where we are today and what we can expect from the future. And it's very interesting that we are discussing Ukraine, because I would like to, because it's a very nice map. I'm sitting here, I'm looking at the map behind our panelists, and you can see that in this dialogue between Central Europe, Germany, and Russia, something is missing there. And maybe we are missing participants and experts from Ukraine, Belarus, maybe other countries, because this is about the European project. In my understanding, if we are discussing with Russia, the only topics we can discuss are sort of European project, because Russia is a big European country, and I would raise the arguments against those who think that this is something different as Euro-Asian country, that Russia has a different, not European values, etc. So I'm fed up with this discussion because Russians are Europeans as we are, and the roots of our culture are the same. Our understanding what's bad and good is very similar what Russians, Ukrainians, Belarusians, etc. So we share. So we are Europeans. But because of the size of the Russia, strength, etc., and the history, it's a key issue how all we understand what might be future European project. And Ukraine, and let me just elaborate a bit on the dynamics of the momentum. We are in this year, 2013, on the eve of the Vilnius summit, which is really very important, whether there will be any Eastern partner country able to sign this association agreement, either Ukraine or Moldova or any other, we'll see, but Ukraine is very important. It is about the Northern standards, and the EU, and from this point I understand Russians, because the EU is not easy partner to talk or to have a deal with the EU, because when it comes to external relations, the EU is a very strange animal. If you look at the EU, 27 member states, and actually the only one agreement we can have within the EU when it comes to external relations is the export of standards and contracts. We are unhappy with Russians because there is no contract between the European Union and Russia, because we cannot exist simply without having. This is our culture. This is how the EU was built up, how it is constructed. And simply in external relations, we need contracts. And if Portugal and Slovakia can agree on some very specific issues when it comes to relations with Russia, and Ukraine is the only thing they can agree, and all EU members can agree, let us work to export our standards, or acquis communautaire. We can have a completely different perspectives on many different issues, but we have 100% consensus with the European Union that we need association agreement with partner countries, and this is really very important. Why? If Ukraine signs association agreement with the European Union, including this EFTA, that means that Ukraine will absorb or have to absorb 95 trade-related or single market-related European acquis. In fact, Ukraine or any partner country which will sign this agreement, this type of association agreement which is offered to partner countries, in fact, they will join European economic space, and they will receive equal status, very similar like Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein, or so-called EEA countries have. This is very important. No one speaks about their political membership, but let me just explain, and I will conclude why this is important. If we want to speak about the future of the EU-Russian relations, the key issue is whether we can speak about the future sort of formation of common European acquis. I know that this is a crazy idea, because acquis is what is dividing us. All enlargement policy of the European Union is about that some countries have to adopt something, very costly, very painful. It's not really easy to manage the process, but then it's, at least our case, of our countries, is that it was very successful in case of Slovakia, that we got, economic development, everything. But the existing acquis divides EU from the non-EU member states. My question is whether we can, it's just vision, just idea for the future, to have an institutional dialogue, not so much discuss the past, but the future in terms whether we can develop institutions between EU and Russia and partner countries and customs unions about the future acquis which is not existing, and still, because it doesn't exist now, it cannot divide us. So this is a crazy idea, just to follow to what you, Mr. Krum-Ost, has to do. Thank you.
Possibly crazy ideas. Another comment, another question. Otherwise, we can conclude. There's one question.
Thank you so much. My name is Anneli Gabani, former colleague of Andrei Zagorski at Stiftung Wissenschaft und Politik. I would just point to two things which have been discussed here. The one thing was that there was a comparison made, Carsten Vogt made it between the great power status of Germany after the Second World War and Russia. I think there are, however, Russia after the collapse of the inner and the outer empire. I think there is, however, a difference because I would rather go in the direction of seeing in what is going on with Russia in post-Soviet times as a process of decolonization. And we had these two layers of, I mean, it's not something very original, but I think it fits what's going on. And we have the former Soviet Union, where the process has a very special nature, and where Russia has been trying from the very start, from 1991 on, to gather and to recollect this these former Soviet states into something which would, however, keep it under Russia's influence. And obviously, if we remember, for instance, these new contracts with the former Warsaw Pact countries, you know, the new friendship and cooperation agreements. In the case of Romania, for instance, it was quite clear that Russia was trying to impose on Romania, and it almost succeeded, and also on Bulgaria, by the way, an agreement where there was still a kind of droit de regard, a kind of limited sovereignty enshrined in these contracts. What I want to say, it is a very special case, and we should keep this in mind, because it's also the past, and the past 20 years. Second thing is the idea of, unfortunately, I beg your pardon? Yes, I will certainly be shorter than my colleague before. The second very brief idea was about blockade. I think it's important. We should see the advent, the joining of the former communist countries from the Comecon and the Warsaw Pact obviously brings a new quality to the EU. And it's not only a negative quality, it's not something which blocks our otherwise wonderful relations with Russia, both on the bilateral level and on the multilateral EU. It's very different. Perhaps it brings a new quality, but it might also be a quality of eye-opening, of experiences which unfortunately have been tested and which should be included into our efforts, obviously, of dealing with Russia. Russia, if we remember, and this is my last sentence, when it saw that there were blocking aspects in its relations with the enlarged EU, started to sort of try to prefer bilateral relations to the multilateral relations, because it was easier to deal with the countries, of the older EU countries, bilaterally. Thank you very much.
Yeah, Iris Kemper. I was delighted hearing about this project from the Friedrich-Ebert Foundation, since I have been initiating similar initiatives, and this evening brings together old friends. It's something good, but I have thousands and millions of questions. I will not ask them right now, don't be concerned, Reinhard, but just two. First one, unfortunately, I received the policy paper rather late, which was Monday evening, and was not able to go deeper into details. But obviously, Poland was evaluated as a test case for Central European Russian cooperation because of the institution, because of overcoming legacies of the past. I agree. But nevertheless, at the same time, there are also other best practices, lessons learned, which is, for instance, Northern Dimension or the Baltic Sea States cooperation, where cooperation is less driven by institutions, but overlapping problems which can only be solved jointly. So that's a different but not less interesting approach. So I would want to overstretch the Polish issue. It's a good one. I completely agree with you, but nevertheless, looking broader might help the project. Second point, Andre asked why the Central European countries has to improve relations with Russia. You are a member of the EU, and the EU is in deep crisis with Russia. The EU since 2007 is not able to elaborate a new PCA, a new framework agreement, and the EU needs your input because you have networks, knowledge, and experience. And something has to come up to reshape European relations with Russia. And the EU, from a Russian, Andre might disagree, but I would say from a Russian perspective, the EU is perceived weaker because of economic crisis, integration crisis. But to make the EU as an attractive partner, the EU needs you, needs actors from Central and East European Union. And I'm looking forward to your comments.
Good evening, my name is Frank Häuser. Since 2007, I've been working as a consultant for a project which fits in. I support the Nord Stream project as a consultant, and there are two things I've learned about the project in the course of my cooperation between Europe and Russia. And these 2 points have already been mentioned in tonight's discussion, and that's historical stumbling blocks that became tangible again and again, not only in the Baltic states and Poland, by the way, but also in Sweden. When we speak about Baltic Sea cooperation, there are a lot of problems arising from history that are in our way, vis-à-vis everything that comes from Russia. A classical example for these historical resentments were the refusal to grant permission to carry out investigations with the Estonian exclusive economic zone in the course of a provisional obligatory testing of alternatives which had to be granted according to European legislation. A survey was carried out in the Estonian population, and a majority of more than 90% adopted against the Russian pipeline to be built through Estonian waters. The next day, the permission was not granted anymore. This is one point which serves as an example for the discussion. The second point is this. We spoke about the export of standards, something which is quite imminent to the EU. It loves exporting its own standards to countries abroad. This is what we've learned in the course of the ESPO project, where all the littoral states of the Baltic Sea need to analyze the cross-border environmental impacts that the project might have had. The 5 country representatives joined in, who were immediately impacted by the project, as well as the Baltic states and Poland, as those countries which might be indirectly affected. In the course of this ESPO project, and here one thing needs to be added, Russia, by the way, participated in the project, although Russia has not yet ratified the ESPO Convention, but it was willing to pretend that it had. I think this is a major step towards confidence-building measures. And standards were accepted, even though nobody said that an attempt was being made to comply to European standards enshrined in a European directive, understandably so, because as a sovereign state, which is not a member of the European Union, prefers to refrain from doing so, why should anyone tell you that you're supposed to, or that you should accept standards coming from another union? But Russia accepted a very high standard for environmental feasibility studies to be carried out. But nonetheless, in the course of its ESPO project, time and again, the representatives of the other side, in this case, it was the member states of the European Union, did not respect these steps appropriately enough. But the European Union representatives simply tried to transfer the European environmental impact study principles on Russia. But why not accept that there is goodwill and willingness to move closer to each other? As long as we don't respect that, I think there is lots of room for improvement. So first of all, historical problems in this context and the ESPO project. Thank you so much. As a host, we're in a rather difficult situation. We are running really late, and I would like to come to a close. The two questions that you still have in this room, let me recommend to you that you try to get the answers over a glass of wine later on during the reception. I don't want to pass the floor to each and everyone, but I would like to try to ask Mr. Debsky to answer the questions that were asked.
Very briefly, I agree with Iris Kemper's point, Iris, hello, that we need to shape a full-fledged architecture of the relations between European Union and Russia, not only building a bilateral institution, but using the instruments, useful instruments of European Union, building close border cooperation. For instance, I personally believe that there is a great perspective of enhancing communication, dialogue, relationship between the Kaliningrad region and neighboring to it regions of European Union. And the case of Polish-Russian closed-border visa-free regime is very telling, is a very positive example. It could be used by both sides, I mean, Russian foreign policy and European Union actors, those who support the liberalization of visa regime between European Union and Russia as an example of best practices, as an example of helping enhancing the communication between the societies. We can work on it, we can elaborate in more detail this good example, and we can move this, let's say, or transform these best practices here and there towards other cases and in other regions. I also agree very much with the thesis that through joint research on historical issues, we can approximate our understanding of the history, and in fact, we can use historical research as a confidence building measure if we do it jointly. And my last comment concerns the terms used by Sasha. Sasha, we have to be very precise in the terms we apply in our discussions concerning relations between EU and our eastern neighbors. We are not going to export our norms and values. We offer them. The main problem between European Union and Eastern Europe is the development gap. There are no parties, there are no actors who are perceived integration within the European Union as an instrument of effective catching up. We did it, I mean, the countries of Central Europe. We are very much determined to use European integration as an instrument of effective modernization and catching up in terms of development. In Ukraine, in Belarus, yes, indeed, in Russia, we do have such partners to talk about it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Carsten.
Russland hat in den letzten Jahrzehnten, eigentlich ist es auch schon.
In the past few decades, Russia, and actually even before that, they made proposals for common European developments. I mean, they did that in economic terms, in security terms, and I never believed that in the past decades this would have led to any success in the context of some type of conference. I don't really know whether such a joint European project is possible at all. But there is at least one minimum requirement. There won't be a joint European anything if there was no economic cooperation, political close cooperation. So this does not mean just ignoring the EU or just doing away with NATO, for example, but nothing would work if the countries of Central and Eastern Europe would not be on board. So just to talk to the Western ones is not enough. So, and the Eastern ones will never get on board if they fear that their interests are not taken seriously. So if their position is not taken seriously or respected at all. So the major projects that the Russians have, they will only be possible if the smaller steps will be accomplished with the smaller neighboring countries, because that is the overall target of the dialogue that we have been carrying out here. So there's a big idea behind that, but I believe that we need to take small steps to make the big step possible. Andrei, you have the floor.
Briefly, this would be one more issue. I believe Russia-EU relations may be another subject for discussions between Russia and the CE countries. Based on what I have learned during the last 2 years, I don't know exactly where it would take us. It would be a very controversial issue, but this is exactly why it could be put on the agenda. So what we all can contribute towards taking next step to the Russia-EU relations, and just looking at what issues are most controversial there.
Okay, thank you very much. I would just inform you that one of the issues we had and some of the panelists discussed about history, the idea of this project, as Mr. Gernot Erler put at the very beginning, was to have chapters on countries written by two authors, one Russian and one from the country, Lithuania, Poland, and so on and so forth for the last 20 years, to have a common idea about the transformation, about the development. I agree that this is a very honest and a very good move and just a starting point. Clearly, tonight we didn't want to offer you 5 subjects and here we go and that's what we continue. This is a matter of discussion, it's a process. We keep you informed. Thank you very much. I would like to thank all the participants who came from various countries tonight. I would like to thank you, Berliners, who came. I understand that there are many conferences and many seminars out there. You came to ours. Thank you very much, and I hope we all see you soon again. And please don't miss the wine and the bread outside. You're welcome. Thank you very much.